Put it here. Okay. So, yes, so as Satyajoti was saying, I come from Tiratanaloka, and I also wanted to really, really thank you as a Sangha for supporting us in our move. Some of you will know that the Tiratanaloka is where we have retreats for those who've trained, women who are training for ordination. And to put it into context, our program came out in September, and it sold out for 2025 in 4 hours because we're just too small to take the number of women who've asked for ordination and to have them on retreat. So we're moving, basically. And it's thanks to a lot of your efforts that we're able to do that. We put an offer into a property and we're just waiting for that to come through. So I really, really wanted to thank you, because I know some of you have really given very, very generously and have also done wonderful events. Nagavajra, I can see you've prostrated for 24 hours or something ridiculous, and Daya Singer prostrated up Mam Tour, and I've been looking at the board of Tiratanaloka Unlimited. I sent a photo of it to the community, and we were all so pleased and delighted. So thank you all. And I know that we got quite a lot of money from the Sangha hustings, I'm informed. So Sangha Day hustings. So I just really, really wanted to thank you. It gives us a lot of confidence and just encouragement in our work that you are so generous and support us in these ways. And I'm really pleased to be asked to talk about Dr. Ambedkar this evening. So as you know, you are following a theme of the refuge tree. And so you can see the refuge tree there, which has all these Buddhist figures on it. And this series of talks on Sangha Night are exploring all those figures on the refuge tree. But some of you who know a thing or two, well, look at that tree and see that there's two figures missing. And the figures are Dr. Ambedkar and Anagarika Dharmapala. So shortly before Bhante Sangharakshita died, this is our refuge tree to the Triratna Buddhist order, which I'm hoping that you know a bit about. But it's figures of inspiration that we feel particularly inspired by in this Buddhist movement. And we used to have a different one in India than outside of India. So the one in India had these two extra figures of Dr. Ambedkar and Anagarika Dharmapala. And I went to see Bhante Sangharakshita before he died. And I said that I thought it was mythologically divisive, which is a term that I believe I invented. That we have two refuge trees, one for India and one for outside of India. And instead of just correcting me on my bad use of the English language, he actually agreed and said, you must action this as soon as possible, Vajratara. We should have the same refuge tree in the whole of the Triratna Buddhist order, and Anagarika Dharmapala and Dr. Ambedkar should be on all refuge trees. So, and I was delighted because he's a personal inspiration of mine. I think the figure of Dr. Ambedkar, I always have a picture of Dr. Ambedkar by my desk, and I believe that I blue tack this picture of Dr. Ambedkar that's on this lectern and has been here for probably about 20 years or something, because I know that he's an inspiration for a lot of the order members and for the community in Sheffield as well. A lot of you go to India on pilgrimage and have learned about Dr. Ambedkar. And I feel that he's an inspiration to me because he's an example of what Bhante Sangharakshita calls a true individual. It was a great concern of early Buddhism to find out who is a great man, not a great man as in a great person. Who are the great people? Because we all want to look up to someone and we all want to be someone. We all want to make our stand in this life to be someone of benefit to ourselves and who has benefit to others. Who is the great person? And the Buddha's answer to that was, he talked about the Aryan. Unfortunately, this word got used in a very negative way later on in world history or European history. But originally, that meant a noble one. Sometimes the word in Sanskrit is pandit. There's a possibility of being someone in this world who is a noble person, a noble one. Someone who's able to break free of their conditions, to not be defined by their past, who's able to work with what they've received in their lives and create something out of it of beauty and love. So there's Sangharakshita and actually Dr. Ambedkar went into the qualities of who this individual should be, who this great individual or noble one is like. What are the characteristics of the true individual? And they both talked about someone who's creative, who's able to think independently. So they don't go along with just what's the received tradition. They don't go along just with a particular train of thought just because other people they know think it. They're able to think independently. They don't go along with something just because society assumes that we will all think and act in a particular way. So they're independent, they're creative, they're independent of thought. The individual is also aware. They're aware of themselves. They're aware of other people and what's going on for other people. They're aware of their environment and what's happening around them. And they're aware of reality itself. And they're also responsible. So they're responsible for their actions. Someone who's a true individual or a noble one is responsible for their actions and goes forth from blame. They're not someone who blames other people for what's going on in their life. They have an emphasis on action and what they can do to create something in their conditions. The way Sangharakshita put it once is he said that there's a possibility of love where there's no reason for love, and hope where there's no reason for hope, and to build heaven in hell's despair, which is a quote from Blake. And I think that's the qualities of the individual. It's someone who can have quite difficult circumstances, but be able to create something much, much more beautiful, profound, and helpful to others with whatever they receive in their life. Another way of looking at the true individual is someone who has sanity and compassion in the world. And I'm very inspired by that. Sangharakshita gave a talk in the end of the 70s or early 80s, called Buddhism, World Peace and Nuclear War. And what he said is that what we need in society are examples of sanity and compassion. People who see humanity as one and are able to act creatively in the world. And just as it was true then, I think it's even more true now that we need examples of sanity and compassion in a world that is extremely dangerous and difficult to live in. And Dr. Ambedkar was one of those examples of sanity and compassion. So he's a constant source of inspiration and an example of someone who can create out of quite difficult circumstances. And he really made a difference to people's lives. Many of our friends in India, and about a third of our Buddhist order is in India. So there's a lot of Indian Buddhists in this order. If you ask them who is their greatest inspiration or who's giving the greatest example in their lives, tears will come in their eyes and they will say, Baba Saheb Ambedkar. How could it possibly be anyone else? Baba Saheb Ambedkar and the Buddha. They usually actually say Ambedkar first, and they say because it was Ambedkar that freed me from slavery. And that still goes on, even though Dr. Ambedkar died over 50 years ago. So a true individual emerges from the choices that they make. A noble one, a great person, emerges from the choices they make. There's a turning away from old stuck patterns, a turning away from ignorance and greed and hatred, and a turning towards freedom. What we call in Buddhism, there's a going forth from the false refuges and a going for refuge to the true refuges, or what we truly value in this life. And a true individual makes those choices again and again, turning towards freedom, turning towards what they deeply value in this life, and away from old stuck habits, away from greed, hatred, and ignorance. And it's those choices in Dr. Ambedkar's life that I'd like to talk about this evening. In a way, there's so many that I could talk about, but in a way I want to talk about the sort of turning points in his life and the choices that he made that have inspired, well, me personally. I do tend to like to research what I say before I speak, sometimes on a good day. But I thought, no, I'm going to first of all, I just want to write down quickly, okay, what are the turning points, if I think of Dr. Ambedkar, that I can really see in my mind? I can see it all unfolding. So I'd like to talk about a few of these that have inspired me, but also to give a sense of his life. And maybe there's an echo for us in the choices that we make, the turning points that we have in our lives, and how they can be extremely significant. So maybe there's a reflection of your own life in Dr. Ambedkar's life. So the first turning point that I'd like to talk about is when Dr. Ambedkar was a young man. He was born in 1891 in the what we call the scheduled caste. So many of you know that India has a system of graded inequality in terms of the caste system, and that you have the higher castes that have certain rights and privileges, and then below them you have the Shudras, which are the kind of servant classes, and then below them you have the scheduled caste, who don't really even have a place in the caste system, and were traditionally known as untouchable by anyone in the higher castes, sometimes even unseeable. So Dr. Ambedkar was born into a scheduled caste, but he was the first person from his community to finish high school and pass an entrance exam to Bombay University. So here he is, he's a young man, he's the first of his kind. He's the first of his kind because not only does he have incredible determination, but so does his father. And his father believed in him, and his father encouraged him, and his father encouraged his studies. He used to wake Dr. Ambedkar up at 2:30 in the morning to continue his studies. Can you imagine trying to get a British teenager to get up at 2:30 in the morning to study? Good luck with that. But Dr. Ambedkar believed in himself, and maybe partly because his father believed in him. He had great difficulty at school. He was always reminded that he was different. He was different from the other children. It was actually quite exceptional that he got an education at all, and that was partly due to his father being employed by the British Army, which is another story. But he did get an access to education, but it wasn't easy. He was always made to remember who he was. Sometimes he had to sit on the outside of the classroom and watch through the window or the door. He wasn't allowed to have his food and drink with the other children. His food and drink, in case his food and drink polluted the other children in the class. But he did it. He did it, and he not only did it, but he did it well. If he was to succeed at all, he had to excel. So here's a young man with incredible fervor and dedication. And because he was the first person in his community to finish high school and matriculate and pass an exam to Bombay University, there was a great public meeting. And a local teacher who attended that public meeting, who actually became a great ally to Dr. Ambedkar after this point, at the public meeting, he gave him a book that he himself had written called The Life of the Buddha. And he gave the book to Dr. Ambedkar, who had a great effect on Dr. Ambedkar, The Life of the Buddha. The life of the Buddha and the personal example of the Buddha inspired Dr. Ambedkar in all his life and in everything that he did since. And we know this because he writes about this occasion in the preface to a book that he wrote later on in his life called A Buddha and His Dharma. So Buddhism remained from that point on a constant source of inspiration, a constant source of encouragement in Dr. Ambedkar's life. And he had a great feel for the Buddha. I think you really see this. He had a real feel for the Buddha and the Buddha's struggle and the Buddha's life and what he did with his life. There's certain episodes of the life of the Buddha which Dr. Ambedkar can explain, and you can feel that he knows it. There's something about the episodes in the life of the Buddha that Dr. Ambedkar felt very deeply. And sometimes we might have this as well. Sometimes there might be an event, particularly in childhood or in early adulthood, where we're introduced to something that opens our minds and provides us with a sort of golden thread that whatever we do in our life, we keep coming back to that golden thread. It provides us in a sense of a myth in which we can make sense of our lives. And for Dr. Ambedkar, the life of the Buddha was the myth that's made sense of his life. So there was that first turning point. So the second turning point I'd like to say was what I call the bench in Baroda. And before I die, I would like to make a statement. I would like to visit this bench. It's still in existence. It's not an attractive bench. It's not a finely worked old bench. I believe it may even be made out of just stone or concrete now. But it's the bench where Dr. Ambedkar, I would say, made the Bodhisattva vow. God, I feel a bit emotional. Anyway, so Dr. Ambedkar, a very intelligent man, went to university in Bombay. He gained sponsorship by the Maharaja of Baroda to further his education, and he poured himself into his education. He got an MA and PhD in economics in Columbia University in the US. He got an MA and PhD in economics at the London School of Economics. And he became a barrister at law at Gray's Inn in London. It was a very, very significant and hard-won achievement for Dr. Ambedkar. Here's a young man from a community, first in his community to finish high school and pass the entrance exam to Bombay University, going off to the US, to Columbia University, going to London, to the London School of Economics, at great economic hardship, even though he was sponsored by the Maharaja of Baroda to do so. And one can really imagine that he had a lot of gratitude to the Maharaja of Baroda. And out of that gratitude, it was always understood that he would come back after his studies and work for the government of Baroda, to work for the Maharaja. So that's what he did. He'd experienced hardship. He'd probably experienced quite some racism in the US and the UK, some discrimination. But he was very determined, and he came and he had got his education. He called himself at one point the most educated man in India, and I suspect he was. So he comes to Baroda in Gujarat to serve the government. And first of all, he couldn't find a place to live because no one would offer rooms, would offer accommodation to someone from the scheduled castes. So he goes from place to place. He can't find a room. In the end, he actually forms a deception, if not has to lie and say he's a Parsi so that he can get a room in the Parsi guest house. The person running his guest house won't give him a proper room, but he will give him a bed in the storehouse. So there he is with 2 MAs and 2 PhDs, a barrister at law, sleeping in a storehouse which was infested by rats. But he goes to his job at the government offices and he's never allowed to forget where he came from. They won't let him drink out of the same water source. They won't touch him. If they have to pass a paper to him, they throw it on the ground. In the end, it's found out that he's not really a Parsi, and there's almost a riot outside the Parsi guest house until he agrees to leave. So he goes homeless and humiliated to the Maharaja of Baroda and says, "What can I do?" And the Maharaja says, "These things don't change overnight. I'm very sorry you're experiencing difficulties, but I can't help you." And one can imagine the utter humiliation and dejection and frustration that Dr. Ambedkar experiences. And he goes outside the Maharaja's palace and he sits on a bench and he weeps. And what he says to himself is, he says, if I suffer this kind of discrimination, and I am the most educated man in India, I have got 2 MAs and 2 PhDs, and I'm a barrister at law, and I'm still treated like this, what must my fellow people, my fellows in my community face every day? If I'm facing this, what must they face? What must the other people in the scheduled caste face? If I feel like this, how must they feel? And he decided then that he would not rest until he had eradicated inequality in his society and as far as he could in the world. He decided that he would not rest until he had eradicated the caste system. And this is an incredible turning point because Dr. Ambedkar at that point could have chosen an easy life. He could have chosen an easy life to say, right, that's it, I'm done. I'm done with India. I'm going back to the US. I'm going back to the UK. I've got an incredible mind. I've got, incredible education behind me and qualifications. I can go into academia. I can live a good life in either of those countries. And he could have done that. He had a choice between an easy life and an inward-looking option to just further his own career and make himself a bit more comfortable. He could have got into a lot of victim mentality and blame and hatred. He could have become a very bitter man. But he decides that instead he'll stay and work for the benefit of others. He didn't experience himself as a victim. What he thought of was the other people who were also experiencing discrimination at the time. His heart opened. It opened out to other people. It didn't close down on his own suffering and finish there. He decided that he was going to make a difference. And I think often we have this turning point in our life where we could harden to the world, where we could harden into a kind of victim mentality and blame, or we could decide to open out into something much greater and be of benefit to other people. And in a way to fight, but to fight the fight that's worth fighting, which is the fight for liberation for all beings, for everyone. And that's what he did on that bench. And so for the people, friends of mine from Gujarat, that bench means everything, because the decision that he made there affected their lives for generations to come. So it's a very, very special bench. Something happened at that bench which made a difference to millions of people. I don't know why. Sometimes I feel like I must have been on that bench. I can't actually talk about it without feeling extremely emotional. So anyway, but yes, I would like to, if I could go to that bench, I would like to put my head on the ground underneath it. So, how embarrassing, never mind. So he chose to stay and work for the benefit of his people, to work for the benefit, really, of humanity itself. And he tried all forms of social and political action to help others. I won't go into it, it's quite a long story. There is a movie. The movie is very long, but it's a wonderful movie, an absolutely wonderful movie. And you can see some of the kind of social and political action that he took in order to change society, to rid India of inequality, and to help his fellow people, I keep on wanting to say fellow men, but you can't say, it sounds better to say fellow men, but you know I don't just mean men. So he tried all of these things. He was chair in the newly independent India. He was chair of the board that drafted the constitution of the newly independent India. And if you read the opening page of the Constitution of India, it is a thing of great beauty and high, high ideals. And he said he drafted the Constitution of India based on Dharmic principles, based on the principles of the Buddha. He said he based it on liberty, equality, and fraternity, which were values he got not from the French Revolution, but from, as he said, my master, the Buddha. And he saw that it was really necessary in newly independent India, a time of great hope. He saw it was really important to have a good constitution, and he got it. You know, imagine that. You're forming a new country and you decide what constitution you're going to base it on. You can write it from scratch. Wonderful, wonderful opportunity. But he saw it wouldn't work unless people were behind it. He said, however good a constitution may be, it is sure to turn out bad because those who are called towards it happen to be a bad lot. So he was the law minister of the first government of independent India. And after drafting the constitution, he put forward his first sort of bill that was based on this new constitution. And that wanted to change some of the more oppressive aspects of life in India, particularly in relation to women. So he's drafted the constitution, he's putting through a new bill to help people and to get rid of some outdated, oppressive aspects of life in India, particularly towards women. And they wouldn't pass it. He was met with serious opposition. And he was absolutely devastated. So this is my third turning point. The dissatisfaction and disillusionment with the political process. It precipitated a great internal crisis for Dr. Ambedkar. The Indian constitution is a wonderful constitution. It's a thing of great beauty, and it could bring a real positive change. But he called it a palace on a dung heap. He said, I've made a palace and the devil has entered. And he realized that he needed a much, much more profound change. It was going to take something much, much more in Indian society to rid Indian society of inequality. And that profound change would have to be a change of what he called mind and soul. So he said, history bears out the proposition that political revolutions have always been preceded by social and religious revolutions. The emancipation of the mind and soul is a necessary preliminary for the political expansion of a people. He basically realized that you can have the best political system in the world, but unless you change your mind, unless you change your emotions, there'll be no change at all. And he thought the only thing that can bring about a change of mind and soul, we might even say mind and heart, is the only thing that can do that is religion. So Dr. Ambedkar was a deeply religious man. He said whatever he did in his life was precipitated by the religious feelings in himself. And he thought religion was necessary for society, which is quite a kind of radical thing to think, particularly in European countries after the Reformation. We tend to see religion as a private matter, and we've got a deep suspicion about anything that mixes politics with religion. And maybe rightly so, because the church has quite a history in Europe. But after the Reformation, we tend to see religion and society, religion and politics as never to meet, you know, that the religion is a private thing and politics is a social thing. But Dr. Ambedkar thought that religion was necessary for society because law only works so far in society. It can't reach everyone. You can't just have a policeman standing by every single individual's life all the time, making sure you don't do something naughty, ready to arrest you. It's not going to work. Law only works so far. You need a structure of beliefs that governs behavior. The government can't govern the individual's behavior. Only religion can, because religion determines our mental attitudes, which determine our behavior. So I remember seeing once a little meme on, I don't know, Facebook or something, that said, it doesn't matter what you believe, it's what you do that counts. So from a Buddhist point of view, what you do is based on what you believe. And from Dr. Ambedkar's view, what you do in your life is based on what you believe. So what you believe is very, very important because it governs your behavior. So he thought that you have to have religion because it's the only thing that really works. It sort of feeds into mental attitudes. And determines our mental attitudes, which will govern our behavior. But he said it has to be a religion that has morality at its center and not just God. He said it has to have morality at its center and it has to not go against reason. It has to have a belief structure that puts ethics for everyone and not just for people who believe in the religion. It has to have metta or loving kindness, or what he called fraternity at its center, which he said was the same thing as metta or loving kindness, for it to really benefit society. And it has to have a system of beliefs that works on and opens up communication with all sections of society, that has an attitude of reverence and respect for every human being in that society. And he said the only religion that he could really see that has all those things at its center, ethics, love, communication, respect and reverence for everyone at its center, is Buddhism. And he said Buddhism is important because it works directly with the mind itself on those mental attitudes. It has a path of ethics, meditation, and wisdom. And those things change our mind and they reorientate our mind around loving kindness for all. And an attitude that sees humanity and the environment as basically one. He said that that kind of system of graded and fixed inequality comes from the mind. He said inequality is not bricks and mortar, it's not barbed wire, it's an attitude of the mind. And he said, what the mind creates, the mind can undo. The mind can create division in human beings, but it can also bring them together. And it's Buddhism that teaches us how to change our mind and bring us all together to go forth from divisions. So this was a great turning point. Sometimes we have to abandon our life's work. Can you imagine? You've got to be this educated. You've got to be the law minister of the newly independent India, and you've realized it doesn't work. I mean, it's actually very good that he did put that into place, because if he hadn't, then there wouldn't be, did do a lot of good and put a lot of things into law. But it wasn't enough. So he had to see through everything he'd built up in his life and see that it wasn't enough. And he had to turn to the unknown. And sometimes we have to do this. We have to let go of our old ideas about what we think our life's work is, that we act in one direction for so long and then we see it's not enough. And at that point, we have to let it go and let something new come in. So that was a great turning point for Dr. Ambedkar, to let go of a political solution, or a solely political solution. And the fourth turning point is his meeting with Sangharakshita. So he's disillusioned with politics, and in 1952 he met a quite serious young man, someone in his late 20s, a bhikkhu, a Western bhikkhu from originally from South London, who was living in India but had been ordained for a number of years. And this young man came to see him. He'd read an article that Dr. Ambedkar had written about the Buddha and the future of his religion. So there's a young bhikkhu, very pleased to meet Dr. Ambedkar, and there's Dr. Ambedkar, who's called Bhimrao Ambedkar, the Bhim meaning the fearsome one. So this young bhikkhu, you might imagine, is Sangharakshita, and Sangharakshita's waiting to see Dr. Ambedkar, quite excited about this meeting. He's a very famous, controversial figure. Sangharakshita gave a number of talks about this episode. He's waiting in the waiting room to see Dr. Ambedkar, and this delegation come to see Dr. Ambedkar, and they garland Dr. Ambedkar, and Dr. Ambedkar brushes him off and shouts at them and takes these garlands off his head. He's obviously not wanting these garlands. He's really berating them about putting these garlands on his head. And Sangharakshita says he's not sure what they were all saying to each other. He knew that Dr. Ambedkar was berating them, was looking in his particularly fearsome aspect. And the delegation who'd come to see him didn't mind at all. They just looked up with him, absolute admiration and love. And it didn't matter what he was saying to them. And so Sangharakshita obviously was a little bit nervous going in to see Dr. Ambedkar. And he went in to see Dr. Ambedkar, and he said to Dr. Ambedkar, he goes, greets, they introduce each other. And Dr. Ambedkar says to Sangharakshita, why does your Mahabodhi society have a Bengali Brahmin for its president? And that's the opening gambit. Why does your Mahabodhi society have a Bengali Brahmin for its president? And Sangharakshita says, well, it's not my Mahabodhi society, and I'm not a member of the Mahabodhi society because it has a Brahmin as its president. So this is, if you don't know, this is a Buddhist society. And why is it not run by Buddhists, by Buddhist monks particularly? So after that, and that exchange of thoughts, they get on quite well. And we're very lucky because this evening, you might be wondering what's going on here. This evening, we're going to unveil a painting. And the painting is commissioned by a great venerable and Vajratara, and it's painted by Sangharakshita, and it depicts this very meeting. Now I'm going to try and offer that setting front to it. So I had a lovely afternoon with Mogavagsa looking at this painting, and I think Sangharakshita's got something very, very. He's got that moment of Sangharakshita walking into Dr Ambedkar's office, going to meet him, and Dr Ambedkar is they're sort of poised on the edge of something, and this edge of something became incredibly important in the future, this meeting of Sangharakshita and Dr Ambedkar. And you can see Bhante Sangharakshita, slightly rough-shaven as he was, very still, very mindful, slightly looking into the distance, which you get, he sometimes did that, Sangharakshita. And apparently Dr Ambedkar really liked these kind of vases. He had a selection of them, and he really liked roses. With a typically Indian picture of the Buddha behind him, and Dr Ambedkar there in his slightly crumpled Western suit. He was slightly crumpled because he worked. He worked, and he worked, and he worked. And for Dr Ambedkar, that was the most important thing. So this was a turning point, not just for Dr Ambedkar, though it was helpful to Dr Ambedkar. It was a big turning point in Sangharakshita's life, because Sangharakshita said that it made him aware not only of the social dimension of Buddhism, but the social dimension of existence itself. And it made him aware that your being, that Buddhism itself isn't just about the individual. It's not just about the liberation of the individual. It has an effect on society. So Dr Ambedkar became a great inspiration for Sangharakshita. And they had another series of meetings. The second was to talk about how Dr Ambedkar could become a Buddhist. And the third was about how to continue that new Buddhist movement after his death. And it was Sangharakshita who really took up the task of helping Dr Ambedkar with a new Buddhist movement, as we'll see. So this moment is on the edge of something, and neither of them knew how important this meeting was. But this meeting became very, very important for millions of people. So sometimes there's a turning point that you don't quite know is a turning point. But it was Dr Ambedkar's being that had an effect on Sangharakshita. The way he lived, what he thought, his perspective on Buddhism, that totally broke open Sangharakshita's thought and the way he went about founding a new Buddhist movement himself in the UK in 1967. So Ambedkar became instrumental in Bhante Sangharakshita's work, and from that moment, that meeting had an effect on us here, right now, and they're just on the cusp of it. So the fourth turning point is taking up Buddhism. So in 1956, Dr Ambedkar formally embraced Buddhism. I say formally because that current of inspiration from Buddhism, from the Buddha, had always been with him. And he had thought long before, he'd been talking about it from the 1930s, about embracing Buddhism formally as a path. But he had some dissatisfaction with Buddhism, and he had some dissatisfaction with the monastic Sangha, who he called the Great Army of Idlers. And hopefully his meeting with Sangharakshita slightly persuaded him with something different on this point. So he embraced Buddhism with 400,000 followers in Nagpur in 1956 on the 14th of October. And he did this by taking the refuges and repeating the refuges and precepts after a very senior Theravadan bhikkhu who was there. And then he turned to his followers and he said, if you want to embrace Buddhism, stand up. And they all stood up. 400 or 380, who knows, 1,000 people, all dressed in white, all immaculately addressed in their best clothes, in white, clean, happy, inspired, purified in their minds. Their minds were so clear and bright. Do you embrace Buddhism? And the whole 400,000 people stand up and they put their hands together, and he recites and they recite after him, to the Buddha for refuge I go, to the Dharma for refuge I go, to the Sangha for refuge I go. And they recite after him the 5 precepts. So this was a really radical move because Dr. Ambedkar had taken the refuges and precepts from the monk, but the followers had taken the refuges and precepts for him. And this really taught Sangharakshita about the fact that it's not your lifestyle as a bhikkhu that's most important. What's most important is the intensity of your commitment. And his followers could take the refuges and precepts from him because his intensity of commitment was enough to inspire their intensity of commitment. There was a great feeling involved at that time. And then Dr. Ambedkar had written an extra 22 vows, which the 400,000 people also repeated after him. And what those vows are about what they were committing to leave behind as new Buddhists. They were going to leave behind the old ways of being, the old gods, and take up the Buddhist refuges and precepts. So there's a turning point here, because I think a true turning point is not just your own turning point. It's helping other people on the path that you are taking. It's also a turning point of leaving behind, in the words of a song, the ways of making me love what I really don't want to love, and taking on what we really do love and we're really committing to. It's a turning point of taking up a definite commitment of what we most truly value. So there's the image of Dr. Ambedkar. He's standing in white. He's got garlanded with a staff in hand, and he's reached the end of his journey. He looked like, in that moment of the mass conversions or the embracing Buddhism, he looked like a pilgrim with his staff in his hand. He was quite ill at that point, so sometimes he leaned upon his wife. And he died not long after that particular event. But the image is not of him on his own. All the other turning points, they're him with a few people. But with this turning point, he's with 400,000 people and many more in the days after. Hundreds of thousands of people embracing Buddhism. And it's also a turning point which is a continuation of his work. So he did die shortly after. But that moment had an impact on others, and in a way was setting forth his vision of a new Buddhist community. And he had this vision of a new Buddhist community which would be highly educated people, what he called a body of intellectuals. Not just intellectuals in a distant academic sense, but more like trained, skilled, or learned people who really educated themselves, who could understand what they were talking about, understand the complexities of issues involved in people's lives and in society. People that you can rely on to offer true and impartial guidance to others. not victims of their own lives, but educated in the true sense of trained and skilled, able to offer guidance to others, a model society for others who could work together, have friendships with each other, and inspire other people with a vision of a greater ideal. He said this model society of the Buddhist community would be everything to do with the world. They wouldn't separate themselves from the world. And he wanted this kind of model society of a Buddhist community to be free to do service to the people. And he said the duty of a Buddhist is not merely to be a good Buddhist. Their duty is to spread Buddhism. They must believe that to spread Buddhism is to serve mankind. So this turning point is also a vision for the future, that our lives are not our lives alone. They impact others, and they impact others for good, or they impact others for ill. But, we've got the tools. We're all in the Buddhist Centre. We've got the tools to make a real impact on other people in our lives, to be an example of sanity and compassion in the world, and to spread Buddhism. So in a way, a question for you is, do you think that's to spread Buddhism is to serve mankind? Because Dr. Ambedkar did, and he was a very, very intelligent man. I was reading today in my emails a quote from Shobin in Malta, which was something he said when the war between Ukraine and Russia broke out. He said, "That was the day I decided to stay and work for the Dharma as the only viable answer to the human insanity of war." So I think in a way this is also the turning point. Do we not only commit ourselves to the path of Buddhism, but help others to commit themselves and to spread that path of Buddhism to be of service to mankind? That's the last turning point that Dr. Ambedkar had. So I'm going to finish there, but I want to just finish with there's a great genre of Ambedkarite songs, particularly in Marathi. You heard one of them when you came in. I quite like them, actually. Yes, when there's an anniversary of the 1956 and 400,000 people embracing Buddhism, they just all night there's a kind of celebration. The most popular stall on those celebrations is the older students helping the younger students with their essays. The biggest seller are the Dharma books and Dr. Ambedkar's complete works. There's a whole kind of emphasis on education. And all night, there's little troops of people singing devotional songs to Dr. Ambedkar with a harmonium, squeezy box. And this is one of them. His heart was with the people who suffered, every breath aware of the deep pain of human beings. Let him breathe in peace at last at the shore of the Arabian Sea. O ocean, be calm now. The pyre is still burning at the shore. Every stick of the pyre is still giving the message of liberation. Let the spark of a single stick catch the fire of liberation in our hearts. O ocean, be calm now. Baba is at rest now. Baba is at rest now.